So today's agenda, as you would have seen from the emails that were sent out, is that we're going to have a look at what components you need in your governance, risk and compliance program. While the list won't be exhaustive, we'll just touch on some of the highlights and some of the practical things there. We'll then have a look at how we can tie them together. We'll have a look at a relatively straightforward example, but then also maybe a more complex example where we'll talk about how we can actually tie it together from our strategic objectives right down to things like our key risk indicators and incidents and stuff like that. And then we'll move into reporting. So when we do all of this work, actually, how do we report it to our audit and risk committee or our board or whoever it might be? And as I said, there is that Q&A box there as well. So we'll try and leave a couple of minutes towards the end to run through any questions that people might have. Firstly, for those of you who don't know us, I know there are a couple of people on the call that I know myself personally. We're a company called calQrisk, where all our backgrounds are in risk and compliance. So when the organization was initially found, it was almost like a niche risk and compliance service provider. But over the years, we've developed a governance, risk and compliance solution that's used by probably over 50 housing associations at this stage. We're involved in all sorts of different professional organizations and international standards, including the ISO 31000, which is the International Risk Management Standard. But to kick us off, we're going to have a look at those components that we expect to see in any sort of a governance, risk and compliance program. And as I mentioned as well, this list isn't exhaustive, but it's just some of the things I just wanted to touch on. So a board, committee, management structure that's suitable to the size, scale and complexity of the organization. And really what we're alluding to here is that there is no copy and paste model. While you do have to satisfy regulatory requirements or whatever it might be, the governance structure, management structure for an organization that maybe has 80,000 homes versus a housing association that has 8,000 homes should look and feel completely different. So you're really looking for what's going to work in your own environment, and what might work for you might not work for everyone else. The next thing I want to touch on under the governance umbrella then is the policy management framework. So this is kind of a grand name for basically, we come across lots of organizations that might have 30, 40, 50 different policies, and the list continues to grow every year. They might have annual review cycles, but what's missing is a framework that ties it all back together. So who owns the policies? When are they due for review? How do we review them? How do we also make sure that people understand them? So have we got a policy attestation process? So it's one thing having these 40 or 50 policies that maybe the board approves, they're stored nicely in our SharePoint or in our e-learning solution or whatever it might be. But how do we actually make sure that everyone that works in the housing association actually understands and knows them? And is there an opportunity for them also to be able to raise any challenges or queries they might have around different policies that might be there? And then the last thing we'll touch on, and we'll come back to this in a while when we look at one of the practical examples as well, is key performance indicators, and are basically stemming from our strategic plan. So I can only assume that everyone will have some sort of corporate plan or strategic plan in place. You'd expect to see objectives there, which in turn will hopefully kind of come down to key performance indicators or performance metrics. Again, everyone has different names on that sort of stuff. On the risk side of things, really you're looking for that defined risk management process. And that stems from everything from our risk assessment process, risk categorization, our impact matrix, our criteria, how we do risk assurance, do we do independent risk assurance reviews, and our reporting cycles. So linking back to that governance structure, do we send all our risk information to the board? Do we go through an audit and risk committee first, where they may get more detailed information and maybe the board might get a summary or a synopsis? One of the things I wanted to point out here on the risk management process as well, for those of you who maybe are at an early stage of kind of implementing some governance, risk and compliance processes or on a journey, it is always good to get more people involved at the very beginning. So for those of you familiar again with the 3 lines model or 3-line of defense model, if you can get the first line or the business unit owners or the managers really involved in the risk assessment process and owning that risk assessment process, you'll reap the benefits further down the road. The next thing I want to touch on then is a defined incident management process. And when we talk about this, particularly in the housing space, we tend to think of incidents as health and safety incidents. So something that might have happened to a tenant or maybe a member of staff while doing repairs or maintenance or whatever it might be. But really, there are lots of different incidents that are happening all over the organization. They might be cyber incidents, data protection issues, or anything else like that. Lots of organizations have even gone as far as now tracking near misses. This being where something nearly happened. And I was actually talking to an organization recently, and they described that they've actually broken it down into near misses and also good catches. So near miss is something that they didn't know was going to happen, but a good catch was something that they actually spotted even beforehand. So defined incident management process, really that allows us to do trend analysis, root cause analysis, learn lessons over time, but then will also indicate any potential control failures that will stem back into that risk management or risk assessment process that I just alluded to earlier on. And then the last piece on the risk that I just wanted to touch on as well is the key risk indicators. And while a lot of organizations might have key risk indicators, probably stemming from something like a risk register, this is maybe the more proactive or real-time or close to real-time risk assessment. So an example of a key risk indicator might be the number of complaints we receive in a reporting period. Let's just keep it simple and say a month. Have we got a red, amber, green threshold? Have we got contingency plans? So if we maybe move from that green to the amber area, what are our contingency plans? Will we escalate it to the board of directors? Will we go to our audit and risk committee? Do we have a different committee maybe that we can escalate it to? And then for each key risk indicator, one of the things that should become quite clear is that it should have an owner, a frequency at which we monitor it, and that contingency plan that I mentioned as well. That should all be documented too. So when you're thinking about your wider risk management program, do think about documenting the ownership and reporting cycle and escalation process or contingency planning on the risk side of things. Moving over to compliance, really what we're looking at, and very similar to our risk assurance process, is having a documented compliance assurance process or compliance review process or whatever it might be. So how do we do assurance testing and how do we report? And one of the things on reporting, and we're going to touch on it later on as well, is striking a balance between providing enough information that the report is useful, but also not providing too much that people become overwhelmed and can't interpret some of the results. One of the things I wanted to point out here on the compliance assurance process as well, when you're building out these processes, or if you already have them built and maybe they don't tie back together, it's a great way to get buy-in to have your risk assurance process and your compliance assurance process somewhat similar. So maybe that the action tracking is similar, the reporting is similar, how you go about some of the work or the field work might be similar as well. And then that brings us on to the compliance breach process, which again, would be nice to tie back into that incident management process. I do know a couple of housing associations that talk about incidents, and it can be a compliance breach, a policy breach, or whatever it might be. But at the top level, they have an incident framework or an incident management framework, and then they categorize under those. So when you are thinking around those separate processes, do think about how you could tie them back, particularly in action tracking, reporting. Really does lead to more buy-in across the organization and also less duplication then as well. So there's no fear of maybe someone double logging an incident because it might be a cyber issue, but also a compliance breach as well. And then just before we finish up on the key components in any GRC program, two other things I just wanted to touch on that maybe didn't fall under any of the three umbrellas that we would have looked at. So an independent audit process, this could be an internal, it could be an employee or a third party that provides assurance to the board and management team. And again, back to that governance thing, the governance point we had earlier on, where we mentioned that maybe you might be fortunate enough to have an audit and risk committee as well. But one of the things we will touch on as well is how does the other processes influence our audit plan, basically? Does it lead to any duplication? Can we make sure we're doing more impactful work? And then the last component that I just wanted to touch on, and I said this list isn't exhaustive, there are many other things you should be thinking about when you come to the GRC or rolling out any sort of governance, risk and compliance program, is that we are seeing a noticeable shift from third parties and outsourced service providers. So basically anyone that's doing something for the organization in terms of a third party, we're seeing a shift away from those just being looked after by the finance person or the finance team. So it's not just a procurement issue anymore. It's very much more moving into what risks are they posing? Is there any compliance issues? The easy example is always around cyber or data protection. So if your tenant's information is in a system, where is that information hosted? Do they have an information security program? Do they review their policies frequently? That sort of stuff. So we are noticing a sizable shift away from this just becoming a procurement problem, falling back into almost the risk and compliance issue as well. And then just to touch on maybe some of the more traditional or siloed approach that you would typically see across organizations. I'm not saying that this is common in all organizations, but this is kind of maybe what we would have seen 10, 20 years ago, in that people would have had a risk unit, risk team, compliance team, audit team, and there were basically barriers in between them. Not purposely done. It was just that people went off and designed their own process. So very much a typical siloed approach. And maybe one or two people in each team end up speaking to each other or at the same board meeting or committee meeting when they were presenting the reports. But that was it. It was quite a static approach, led to lots of duplication, Very little buy-in then from people because they felt, well, the risk team is asking me about this, but now suddenly I have an auditor over here asking me about this. So back to that 3 lines model, it can be very frustrating at times for people in the first line to maybe think that they're going through a duplicative process. So over the next few slides, we'll have a look at basically how we can kind of tie some of this stuff back together. So we have 2 examples that we're just going to step through. As we shift away from this approach, we hope we get more buy-in, and then it moves away from more of a tick box exercise to actually something more meaningful to the organization, and back to that golden thread where we can basically say, here's our objective, and then write the way down what management information are we collecting to show the impact on that objective. So when I talked about those 2 examples that we're basically going to work our way through, we have this risk assessment process. Hopefully it's not a static process. Hopefully it's not something that we're just doing an annual risk assessment process, or what some people call an RCSA, a risk and controlled self-assessment. Hopefully it's a bit more real time. There's more ownership. It's not just the person responsible for risk doing it. And then usually one of the big outcomes after that process, if it is a static process or more real time, is the risk register. Lots of organizations will report on the risk register monthly or quarterly or whatever it might be. And then that's where it almost stops. So that's a cycle, if you like, where it goes risk register, update our risk assessments, maybe put some new controls in place, risk register. And just 2 things that we're just seeing again, a shift towards is the risk register starting to impact the audit plan? So if it is an independent or an outsourced audit function or a member of the team, are they auditing the high risk areas or medium risk areas, whatever it might be? But it is the work that we're doing at the risk side of things impacting the audit plan? And in turn, then making sure that the audit team are doing the most impactful work, and very similar to our compliance and risk assurance as well. When we're doing those reviews, are we cognizant or aware of all the other work that maybe the first line of defense or the first line have done around risk assessments? Again, avoiding that duplication, making it more of a collaborative process, if you like, and then hopefully people do buy into it that bit more. The next example then we're going to look at then is starting at the very top of the organization. So let's start with our strategic plan, where again, we'll have those objectives, our key performance indicators, ownership. And one of the big things at the strategic plan level as well is making sure there's an understanding of the objectives actually across the whole organization. So right from root to branch, basically, and that it's not just a document that lives with the board or a committee or the management team, that everyone understands basically this is their role, and whatever their role might be in the housing association, of how that actually could potentially impact our achievement of our objectives at the strategic plan. And that's one of the things I just wanted to point out about when we mentioned risk earlier on. Sorry, I'm in a room here where there's no light switch and the lights just turned off, so I might need to move to get them to light up again. Sorry about that. So at the strategic plan level, where I mentioned about not achieving your objectives, one of the things to point out around that is that I mentioned ISO 31000 at the start, and having a definition of risk like that, where it's the effective uncertainty on the achievement of objectives, makes risk more meaningful. But under that strategic plan, again, we'll see lots of organizations or housing associations will have what they call a corporate risk register or a strategic risk register. Tends to be quite tightly linked back to the strategic plan. High-level risks tends to be quite a low number of risks in the risk register as well. And ownership tends to lie at almost exec director or senior manager level. So it's their operational risk registers which may be bubbled up into the corporate risk register. And that's maybe something that we might show the board or the audit and risk committee. The next layer down then is our operational risk registers or departmental risk registers or functional risk registers. So these tend to be a bit more detailed, tend to have a few more risks on them. And then the ownership tends to lie with managers or team members as well. So while the exec director or senior manager is ultimately responsible for risks in their business unit or whatever it might be, or across the departments, the idea here is that these are more detailed risk assessments, more detailed controls and things like that too, with a lot more people involved than maybe the corporate risk register. And again, lots of organizations do have that pretty well spot on or nailed, and that they have this flow of information working like that. But again, where we see some of the kind of breaks, if you like, is where we have things like our key risk indicators. So where I mentioned these can act as early warning indicators. But what happens is that something might go red in our key risk indicator. So let's say our complaints number, maybe if we had 5 complaints this period, it's gone to 7, now it's amber, it's gone to 8, it's still amber next period, but then it goes to 12 and it goes red. Does that actually impact our operational risk register or our business unit risk register? How does that impact our corporate risk register? And then in turn, could it actually impact our strategic plan? So that's the idea of starting to link your business unit or operational risk registers back to some of the other management information that you have, and not making them such a standalone process, if that makes sense. The next one then is your audit findings. So as I mentioned as well, if the audit plan is somewhat linked to the risk register and the auditor is doing lots of work around the high risk or medium risk areas, you would expect those findings to be linked back to risks in the risk register. So those findings should be pointing out some of our weaker areas or higher risk areas. But again, if it's not, what happens if we have a low risk around, let's say, something like cybersecurity or data protection, and our auditor is actually doing work on it, has lots of findings? Does that trigger a reassessment of the risk, for example? It should. So that should trigger a reassessment of the risk at the operational risk level. In turn, that should impact our corporate risk. And then in turn, that could almost impact our strategic plan then as well. Very similar to our assurance process then as well. So that compliance, assurance, and linking it all back together then as well. And then the last one that I wanted to point out then was incidents, which we already touched on under the kind of risk umbrella. But yeah, where we have these control failures or root cause analysis that we're doing maybe when we build up a bank of incidents, again, tends to be a bit of a standalone process. We collate all this incident information. It could be around internal policy breaches, whatever it might be. It might live on a spreadsheet, separate spreadsheet to our risk register, and we can't tie that back to our risk. So we struggle sometimes to be able to show that, look, here's the corporate risk, here's the incidents that happened down below the operational risk, and here's all the operational risks as well. So do think about the points at which an incident could potentially trigger a reassessment, as in influence the scoring, or perhaps even introduce a new risk onto the risk register as well. And that might be at the operational level. Moving on to the reporting thing, and I'm conscious we are skipping through this quite quickly, but I do want to leave maybe 5 or 10 minutes for questions at the very end too. So while we've gathered up all that information, how do we actually report on it? And this is one of the constant struggles for our clients and potential clients. So what I've done here is I've just pulled the report that we would have done with a couple of our clients around what we call a roll-up risk, or that corporate level risk. So you can see on the left-hand side, basically I have all my high-level risk information, have my categorization that we talked about as part of our risk assessment process, some additional stuff around source and consequences, an evaluation comment that could be coming from my exec director, whoever it might be that has ultimate responsibility for that risk. I can see down in the bottom left corner, what I'm actually tracking here is my current level of risk. So I can see on the 26th of June, it was 9.0, but my previous 2 assessments, which were quite narrow in time, were actually 10.5. So that allows me to show continuous improvement, demonstrate to the board and audit and risk committee that we are controlling our risks, but that it's also then starting to tie all the different bits and pieces together. So maybe I want to show what objective it actually impacts as well at the strategic plan level. I can then show what risks this risk is linked back to. So I can see that this high level or corporate level risk is around a confidentiality breach. But what actually underpins or influences that scoring is these 6 or 7 detailed risks that we've done across the business. So think back to that diagram we had, or that pyramid diagram we had just a slide previous, where we showed that the operational risks are going to be more detailed, will be higher in number in our risk register, but will still be impacting the corporate risk. We'll then have a look at our monitoring. So our monitoring can be our key risk indicators. And I mentioned about having a red, amber, green section there as well. So when something moves from red to green to amber, whatever it might be, how does that impact our scoring? And it's always useful to think about how can we link these to the corporate risks, but also how can we link them to the operational risks? So it might be that a KRI breach at a low level will impact an operational risk register, and in turn then have that impact on the corporate. But do think around that, avoiding that duplication again, and being able to have my KRIs linked to multiple risks. You could in a couple of other things you could also include in a report like this then as well is the things like tasks. So are there any tasks or controls that we're looking at putting in place around how we're going to further mitigate that corporate risk? And then a couple of other ones that we pointed out under the GRC umbrella then as well is around incidents. So were there any incidents that happened in the reporting period that are linked back to this corporate risk? Were there any audit findings raised or assurance findings? What were they? How are they rated? Are they red, amber, green if you have your own internal rating system or anything like that too? And again, just have a bit of a think then as well, but gathering up all that information and how best to present it to show it back. And I'm conscious some of these slides might be a bit kind of grainy in detail or maybe not zoomed up, but as you will, we'll send them out afterwards. The piece here that I just want to touch on is what our standard risk register might look like. So I have my corporate level risk register, and let's just say in my dummy organization, it looks something like this. So I have my risk description there, which is fairly standard. I have a risk owner, which is myself, my inherent risk, my residual, all the good stuff we're doing, all the controls we have in place. I've put in a control effectiveness label as well. And then I have all the tasks. So that could be our corporate level risk register. But you'll notice over on the left-hand side by the risk ID, I have that little arrow. And this is one of the things we're seeing a lot of people doing, particularly if you have an audit and risk committee, is allowing the board or a director or a committee member, while presenting it like this and having it at the corporate level, but also allowing them self-serve, if that makes sense. So allowing them be able to drill into the information and you have it readily available. So in theory, if I was to click that arrow, I'd be presented then with a more detailed risk register underneath that. So I have my corporate level risk. Again, I can see all of that, but you'll notice then in yellow, or I just highlight them in yellow just for the sake of presentation here, I can actually see my lower level risks there. So again, I can see that ownership, who has it, and how the controls we have in place are at that operational risk level as well, and the residual risk. So I can start to see how that may be impacting the scoring at the residual risk level as well. And I'm conscious I wanted to leave 5 minutes at the end for any questions and answers. We have 6 or 7 minutes left. We only have this one in this webinar in for a half hour. So I'm just going to check, is there anything in the Q&A box, but please do feel free. Actually, there's a couple there. Sorry, I didn't see them as we were stepping through. So one of the questions is, should assurance only look at high risk areas? No is the answer. You don't want to be too influenced by the risk register. While we do want to establish that golden thread and do have everything kind of linked, we don't want the assurance team to be overly influenced by the risk process as well. So they should be somewhat independent, but do use the information to maybe avoid that duplication that I mentioned as well. And yeah, do you get more buy-in that way, basically. There's another one here about key risk indicators. How often should we measure key risk or KRIs or key risk indicators? That one really comes down to how often you want the metrics should be measured, if that makes sense. So if I use complaints, for example, one of the things, depending on the size of the housing association, we see people with key risk indicators for complaints every week, every month, every quarter. Really depends on the volume that you're getting. The most important thing there, though, is that it's not a static exercise, that you are gathering up the information. And then when you do gather up the information, that it actually influences the scoring, so that it's not that standalone or silo process that we had a look at earlier on. There's one here about the board risk register. Sorry, I'm just trying to read them here as I go down through it. So should the board only look at the corporate risk register? The idea here then with the corporate risk register is that the board should be able to look at everything, or the director should be able to look at everything. So you should have all your risk and compliance information readily available. But what we want to do is we just want to show the board the corporate risks. But every year, at least once a year, it's no harm in the board directors doing a deep dive into the operational risk registers as well. So allowing them to be able to see more of the detail that's behind it. But at any point in time, we should be able to just click a button, pull a spreadsheet, whatever it might be, that shows all the operational risks and how they impact the corporate risks. If you do have an audit and risk committee, or a finance audit and risk committee, or whatever the title might be, you might consider about how best to present the information there. So lots of people will go to that committee with a more detailed report, and then we'll go to the board with more of a synopsis, so that it's not just duplicative then. And then I think that's it in terms of the questions. Sorry, there's one here just after popping in here now about incidents. Incidents can be really anything at all. So the question here is about incidents and health and safety and how do you differentiate. So the idea is, if you have an incident management process, gathering the information rather than categorizing the information is almost the first step, or the most important step. So when you think about that, think around, how do you make it easy for the person in the organization to log the incident? Where can they go? What's the form? What's the process? Then after that, then worry about the labeling, the categorization, things like that. But then do have the process around corrective and preventative action. And how do we capture all of that? How do we track it? How do we basically make sure the incident doesn't happen again? So while it could be a health and safety incident or a policy breach or whatever it might be, the idea is that it's all captured. And I think that's really it for me. I'm just going to close the Q&A box here. And I think the last slide then was just on a bit about ourselves and what we do. So I think we had pointed out in the emails that went out that it's just a quick overview of what calQrisk is. And I'm conscious I did want to try and keep this to just 30 minutes because I'm sure there's a lot of stuff going on. So basically with calQrisk, we have a modular governance, risk and compliance platform that assists with all of that work that we just stepped through But I said to you, this slide will be, or these slides and the recording will be sent out as well. So you'll be able to have a look at some of the modules and overview and things like that that's readily available within the solution. So I think with that, unless anyone has any other questions, I think we can leave it there and finish up a couple of minutes early. But thank you all for joining it this morning. And if you do have any questions, my email address is going to be on the very first slide. So do feel free to get in touch directly.